There's a strange pressure that shows up before memory does, a tightness that isn't tied to a specific moment, but to an atmosphere, like walking into a room where the air feels heavy even though no one has spoken yet. The discomfort isn't loud, it's subtle, it sits behind the eyes, in the jaw, in the way your body braces for something it already expects. You don't immediately recognize it as familiar. In fact, you might resist that idea. You might think this is just another reflective video, another attempt to label something ordinary. But then a sensation slips through that resistance, a quiet alertness, the feeling of being on standby, as if some part of you is listening for instructions that never arrive. It's not fear exactly. It's not sadness either. It's closer to vigilance without a clear threat, like waiting for a cue that tells you when it's safe to relax, but the cue never comes. So you don't relax. You adapt to the waiting. People often imagine growing up too fast looks impressive. They imagine confidence, competence, responsibility worn like a badge. But what if it felt less like rising and more like compressing, like being folded inward before you had time to stretch outward? You may have noticed this sensation early on, a sense that play had an expiration date you never agreed to, that lightness required permission you didn't have. That being carefree felt vaguely irresponsible even when no one said it out loud. Instead, there was an unspoken pull toward steadiness, toward being the one who noticed before being noticed, who adjusted before being asked, who learned the rhythm of rooms, moods, silences. You didn't announce your awareness, you simply used it. And the strange part is how invisible this shift felt at the time. There was no ceremony marking the moment you stepped out of something softer. No one said, from now on, you are no longer allowed to be unsure. It happened in increments so small they didn't feel like losses. They felt like competence. There's a texture to this experience that's hard to put into words. A constant scanning, a readiness to respond, an instinct to be useful even when usefulness wasn't requested. It doesn't feel like stress. It feels like preparedness. You might have been praised for it, trusted with things others weren't, spoken to differently, included in conversations that felt slightly off limits. And while that attention can look flattering from the outside, it carries a quiet weight, because being included for your steadiness often comes at the cost of being included for your spontaneity. There's a peculiar loneliness that forms when people rely on your composure. They don't worry about you the way they worry about others. They assume you're fine because you appear fine. You rarely contradict that assumption, not because it's true, but because challenging it would require stepping into a role you never practiced. What's rarely acknowledged is how early this role begins to shape perception. You stop asking certain questions because you already sense the answers. You stop expressing certain reactions because you've learned they complicate things. Over time, this doesn't feel like suppression. It feels like refinement. And yet something faint but persistent starts to hum underneath. A restlessness that doesn't match your outward calm, a sense that there's an entire register of experience you're aware of but not fluent in expressing. You may notice it when others seem effortlessly light, when laughter spills without calculation, when emotions rise and fall without needing to be managed. There's no judgment in this observation, just distance, like watching a language you once heard but never fully spoke. Sometimes the distance feels like superiority. Other times it feels like exile. Neither interpretation fits perfectly. Both are incomplete. You might tell yourself you simply outgrew certain things, that you matured early and moved on. That's the story that makes the most sense. It's clean. It's respectable. But it doesn't explain the flicker of envy you feel when someone else gets to be uncontained, or the discomfort that arises when you're expected to loosen your grip and you don't know how. There's an internal contradiction here. You're often seen as emotionally intelligent, yet there are moments when emotions feel strangely inaccessible to you, not absent, but out of reach, like something behind glass. You can talk about feelings in an abstract way. You can hold space for others effortlessly. But when attention turns toward you, the words thin out. You default to neutrality, to composure, to phrases that don't quite touch the center of what's there. This isn't because nothing is there. It's because what's there was never meant to be handled alone. But alone is how you learn to handle it. As time goes on, this internal arrangement starts to create friction. You may feel exhausted by situations that ask for presence rather than performance. You might withdraw without fully understanding why. Social interactions that once felt manageable now feel draining in a way you can't explain. People might assume you're becoming distant, more reserved, less available, and part of you wonders if they're right. Another part wonders if you were ever truly available in the first place, or if you were simply reliable. There's a difference, but it's subtle, and noticing it can feel unsettling. You may begin to sense that something essential was set aside early on, not out of neglect, but out of necessity. Something tender, something unstructured, something that didn't know how to be useful yet. The sensation isn't grief, at least not in the way grief is usually described. It's more like a faint ache that surfaces in quiet moments, when you're not needed, when no one is leaning on you, when there's finally space and you don't know what to do with it. You might fill that space quickly with productivity, with caretaking, with thought, anything to avoid the unfamiliar feeling of not being required. And yet there's also a curiosity there, a question that hasn't fully formed. What was interrupted? What never got the chance to develop because steadiness took priority over exploration? This question doesn't demand an answer yet. It simply lingers. And the longer it lingers, the more you start to notice patterns you once dismissed. The way you instinctively minimize your needs. The way you feel uncomfortable receiving care without reciprocating immediately. The way rest feels undeserved unless it's earned. These observations don't come with clarity. They come with disorientation because they challenge the assumption that early maturity was purely an advantage. They suggest there may have been a trade-off you never consciously agreed to. Still, you don't name it. Not yet. You simply feel the outline of something missing without being able to say what shape it had. And that's where the discomfort deepens. Because once you sense an absence, you can't unsense it. You start noticing it in the pauses between tasks, in the way joy feels muted, in the way seriousness became default long before it needed to. You might wonder if this is just how you are, or if it's how you learn to be. The difference between those two possibilities is small, but it changes everything. There's a moment, usually much later, when the narrative you've relied on starts to crack, not shatter, just soften enough to let a different interpretation slip through. You notice it when someone calls you strong and it lands oddly, not as praise, more like a misunderstanding. Strength, after all, is often attributed to outcomes, not origins. People see the composure, the capability, the steadiness. They don't see what had to be set aside to maintain it. This is where the idea of distance begins to shift. The emotional flatness, the withdrawal, the sense of being older than your years even now. What if these aren't signs of detachment, but signs of something unfinished? What if what looks like emotional restraint is actually the residue of early responsibility? Not chosen, but assumed, not because you wanted to grow up, but because there wasn't room not to. Here's the unsettling truth that tends to surface only after years of adaptation. When a sensitive person is required to be composed too soon, they don't lose their sensitivity, they redirect it. Instead of turning it outward playfully, it turns inward watchfully. It becomes a monitoring system, a way of ensuring stability, a way of preventing disruption. The part that gets lost isn't feeling itself. It's permission. Permission to be unstructured, to be unsure, to be guided rather than guiding. That's the part that quietly disappears. And because it disappears gradually, you don't mourn it. You normalize its absence. You build an identity around what remains. Reliability, insight, emotional depth. These qualities are real, but they sit on top of a foundation that never got to fully cure. This realization can feel deeply unsettling because it reframes your self-image. It suggests that what you thought was maturity may have also been a form of adaptation to circumstances that demanded more than they should have. The loss isn't obvious. It doesn't announce itself as loss. It shows up as seriousness that feels heavier than it should, as play that feels performative, as creativity that stalls unless it serves a purpose. You may notice that you struggle with rest that has no function, with joy that doesn't lead somewhere, with moments that are meant to be wasted. This isn't because you don't value those things. It's because the part of you that knew how to inhabit them was redirected before it could fully root. And here's the part that can be difficult to hear. This redirection often happened in environments where your awareness was needed, where someone had to notice, to anticipate, to stabilize. Your sensitivity became a tool before it became a playground. The world rewarded that tool. It still does, which makes it harder to question the cost. The distance you feel now, the sense of emotional withdrawal, isn't a sign that you're becoming less connected. It's a sign that the old system is no longer sustainable, that the part of you that's been carrying responsibility internally is fatigued. What's being asked for now isn't more strength. It's reclamation. But reclamation is messy. It doesn't feel noble or efficient. It often feels awkward, indulgent, even regressive. And that's why it's resisted, because to reclaim what was lost requires acknowledging that something was taken before you were ready to give it. Not maliciously, not always intentionally, but taken nonetheless. The unsettling part isn't the loss itself. It's realizing how much of your identity formed around compensating for it. You might notice resistance when you imagine letting go of composure, fear that without it you'd become unrecognizable, or worse, burdensome. This fear makes sense. The world you grew up in taught you that your value was tied to how well you held things together. Stepping out of that role feels like stepping into free fall. But here's where the unresolved tension lives. The part you lost doesn't return neatly. It doesn't come back fully formed. It doesn't ask politely to be integrated. It arrives in fragments, in sudden desires that feel impractical, in emotional reactions that surprise you, in a longing for experiences that don't justify themselves. You may try to suppress these fragments at first, dismiss them as distractions, but they persist, not loudly, just consistently. They're reminders of something that never had the chance to complete its own development, and this is where the reflection deepens. Because the question is no longer what happened back then. The question becomes what happens now that you see it. There's no clear roadmap here. No guarantee that reclaiming what was lost will feel good. In fact, it may feel destabilizing because you're not just adding something new, you're making space for something old that never got to exist freely. The ending, if there is one, isn't about resolution. It's about recognition, about noticing when seriousness is a shield rather than a preference, when composure is a habit rather than a choice. And once you notice that, you may find yourself standing at an edge, not knowing whether to step back into the role you mastered or forward into something less defined. The unsettling truth is that you can't unknow this distinction. And you can't rush what comes next, because the part that was lost doesn't want to be managed. It wants to be met.